Welcome to the December Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. My name is Don Patton. This is the 31st year we've been doing this. Harold and I started this in October of '87, and it's become a great thrill. And veterans of the Battle of the Bulge, except for these four guys. I know there's some in the audience. Merrill, 6th Armored Division, 777th AAA, over here. And by the way, Merrill went on one of our trips to the Bulge 5 years ago. And there, I'm sorry I forgot you. And the last name is Gugamus. He came from Winstead. But he was on our program years back in the 2nd Infantry Division, one of my favorites. So, and then with the other World War II veterans, you guys keep standing. The other World War II veterans in the audience, stand up. Thank you so much for coming. I am so thankful tonight that we got a volunteer by the name of Mark Weens. They kicked him out of the military. Honorably. But Mark, I've been doing this. This is our 31st year, as I mentioned, and it's so great to have Mark and Doug Becky and some of the other volunteers jumping on these, organizing the program. So, Mark, I am grateful. I'm going to sit back and listen.
My first introduction to the Battle of the Bulge was back in 1970 when the movie Patton came out. Many of you probably saw that. I was a single-digit kid. My dad decided to take me to a PG movie which had a lot of violence and a lot of language. He sat me down in our state theater, Windham, Minnesota, Cottonwood County, and I watched the movie and I was fascinated. First by the flag, and then by the battle scenes and Patton's prayer during the Battle of the Bulge. My dad gave me stern warning, forget all the foul language you heard when you go home, so Mom doesn't hear that. And so tonight is sort of a legacy thing for me. I brought my daughter along, Catherine, and her friend Abby, they're both 5th graders, to see what we do. She asked me the other night, Dad, why do you spend all this time with these old guys? What's going on? And I said, well, it's Hogwarts University. There's Gryffindors and there's Ravencliffs and they're all heroes. So these kids are reading this Harry Potter stuff. And so now they're very interested in what's going on because we've got people that are still living with us, that have breath, that have seen this. Some of the things are horrifying, some of the things are funny, some of the things are just life, and you've got to hear about this. So I had this conversation. She said, I want to go, brought her friend. My younger daughter, Margaret, yells out, it's a mandate. So I'm on a mandate with all of you guys per my younger daughter. Okay, that's the comic interlude for this evening. Mr. Michael Collins is with us from the lovely state of New York. Or Western Massachusetts, maybe it's the same. He's a historian and author who has co-written several books with Martin King, and including the Voices of the Bulge, as well as the Tigers of Bastogne, which are on sale in the back, and several other books. Also, the Emmy Award-winning documentary, Searching for Augusta. He specializes in 20th century, specifically the World War II era, and currently works as the Visitor Services Assistant at the New York State Capitol in Albany.
Just the 10th Armored Division was actually the division that my grandfather joined up. He was actually 17 years old. He decided to forge his parents' signature and join up. He'd have what we'd consider today to be ADHD, most likely. He was very much into tinkering with things. He stole one of my grandparents' cars at one point, was driving around, and I guess word got out that he was driving the car that he had hot-wired. Definitely the fact that he became a tanker was really something I think that was in his DNA. Of course, our book, Tigers of Bastogne. But just to give you an idea of what Europe looked like right around the start of the Battle of the Bulge, of course, you have Germany. Things are starting to shrink a little bit. As we're in late 1944, of course, the Russian army is starting to push through Poland and really starting to ramp up their offensive into Germany. And of course, the Allies in the West have already pushed through Belgium. They've gotten into Holland, but of course, Operation Market Garden in September was quite the failure. So you have really a static Western Front where things are very quiet. Of course, you have two Green divisions up in the northern shoulder, the 99th and the 106th, just right off the boat from the United States. And of course, they were told by other seasoned veterans of World War II, you know, they were told, you've got it easy here. It's going to be quiet. Nothing to worry about. So again, just to give you an idea, of course, the plan, of course, the German army wanted to split the United States and the British forces in half and make either side capitulate and sign a separate peace so that then they can send their forces back east to fight the Russian onslaught that's coming towards them. And again, the Battle of the Bulge was one of the largest land battles in U.S. Army history. And when you really do think of how vast it was, I mean, it covered Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg all at the same, at some juncture. So this is actually a really interesting picture. I only found this about 2 years ago. I contacted a cousin who, her mother was actually my grandfather's sister. And this is a picture of my grandfather's unit, Company F of the 90th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 10th Armored. They're in Sierre-les-Bains. It's right on the border of France and Luxembourg. And this is a group photo, and that's actually my grandfather right in the middle, kind of crouched down with the little box around him. That is taken about 2 days before the Bulge began. And you can just see they're very kind of carefree. A lot of these guys are 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and they have no idea what's going to be coming up in about 2 days. So, of course, you're attacking German forces. Of course, the 6th Army commanded by Joseph Sepp Dietrich. Of course, the 99th Division were told, well, you're actually, unfortunately, not going to be meeting Marlene Dietrich. You're going to be meeting, you met Sepp Dietrich. Because actually, Marlene Dietrich was supposed to be performing around Christmas time. And then, of course, you have the 5th Army, commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel. And, of course, the 7th Army, commanded by General Erich Brandenburger. Of course, we just have, of course, Gerd von Rundstedt, of course, is trying to hold together the German forces during this time. And, of course, Otto Model was also part of the attacking forces as well. And, of course, here's Sepp Dietrich. And Manteuffel, and Erich Brandenburger as well. So, of course, we know who this gentleman is, of course, General George S. Patton. When the Bulge actually breaks, of course, Patton is called in with General Eisenhower, and Eisenhower makes a decision. He says, you know, we need to send some armor up to the Ardennes to hold the line as the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne were starting to get called back to be sent up as well. Patton was very angry about this. He did not want to release any of his armored units because he was getting ready to push into Germany in the spring. So really the 10th Armored became almost what we call a ghost division in the sense that they were having to pull off their different insignia so people wouldn't know that Patton had actually sent a part of his armored division, because, of course, psychologically, that was a big thing. If the Germans knew that Patton was on the way, that would really cause a stir. And there's Mr. Patton right there. So again, the situation in Bastogne, once the teams, of course, they kicked off on December 17th. Once they start arriving, they start to break off. You have Combat Command A, which is actually, and I've got it right here, they actually are sent to Luxembourg. They start to hold where the 4th Infantry is, up in Echternach in Luxembourg. Of course, Combat Command B is in Bastogne. Now, the interesting thing is, doing the research for this book, you would talk to veterans who were in units that shouldn't have been in Bastogne, but in the confusion of the split of the two combat commands, some vets got into one line and went to Bastogne when they should have been going to Luxembourg. As for my grandfather, as far as I can tell, when I talked with his tank driver, they were in Bastogne, and I finally got some confirmation from the nephew of their tank commander, who said, oh yeah, his uncle wrote a whole write-up on the entire Bulge, and they said they were in Bastogne itself at different times. And because they were recon, they were everywhere. What I found in the National Archives is that everything is vague. That they, for his unit, they just kind of put these random little town names, but when you look at a map, you say, well, that can't be right, because they're not in the Bastogne area. So with research, you always have to be very skeptical of government reports. I don't think I have to tell you why that is, but that's something that I really found throughout my research, not only on this book, but for other units as well. Combat Command B, they had enough soldiers and tanks to actually split into 3 teams. You had Team Desibry, which was commanded by Major William R. Desibry. Team O'Hara, which was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Smilin' Jim O'Hara. He always had a smirk on his face, and you'll even see in the photograph we have of him. And Lieutenant Henry T. Cherry, Lieutenant Colonel Henry T. Cherry, who, according to many of his soldiers that he fought with, he was pretty much a strict by the book soldier and commander. But when he got out in the battlefield, he was one of the best leaders that they could have. So first off, William Roberts. This is kind of an older photo. There's actually not too many real wartime photos of him. He was the commander of CCB. He had the task of trying to work with the 101st Airborne as they arrive and hold the line. The 101st do come up right after the 10th Armored, but CCB is out on the line alone. They have no one behind them until the 101st start marching in. So they are holding until reinforcements start to come up. And the scary thing is, for a lot of these tankers, they really didn't have that much of a baptism of fire. They fought north of Metz and really just did some cleanup duty. They didn't have too much of a rough of a fight. So they were going in really for their first baptism of fire here in Bastogne. Here's Major William R. Desibry. He fought up in Noville. We'll talk a little more about him. So this is Team Desibry in Noville. This is actually a modern-day photo, so you can get an idea of what it looks like today. This is a nice Google map aerial shot. Noville is kind of split. You have 2 main roads right coming up north. And the Germans were actually set up kind of on the ridgeway a little bit north there. And the problem was that first day the fog just started lifting and coming down and lifting and going up. So neither side really knew what they were facing. The Germans didn't know really how many tanks were there, and the Americans didn't know how much artillery was really backing up the German army. So really Noville became almost a mini Alamo in itself. The overall problem is that really the German onslaught in Noville became just too much. The 101st Airborne arrived. They helped hold the line with the 10th Armored, but it just became too much. The artillery fire and the tank fire really took out the 10th up in Nova. And we're going to discuss that a little more when we talk about some other different characters in our talk. So this is Smiling Jim O'Hara. Kind of got a little smirk on his face there. He was with Team O'Hara, of course, down in Marvie and Warden, which is in the southern team in Bastogne. Now he had trouble because he was on the Wilts Highway, and Wilts is right on the border of Luxembourg and Belgium, and it's in Luxembourg. So he had to hold quite a substantial highway, and we're going to be showing you Don Nichols, who was a tanker in Team O'Hara, and you're going to hear his story of what he had to face. So here's again your Marvie and Warden, Belgium. If you go to Marvie today, you can still see Smiling Jim O'Hara's headquarters. It's actually right in the middle of Marvie. I believe they actually they had a plaque and then it got removed, but they've put a new plaque up there, as far as I've been told from friends over in Belgium. So you can actually see where his headquarters is. And then, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Henry T. Cherry. Cherry had the difficulty of really having to string out his forces all the way to Longville, Belgium. And we'll show you right here. This is he had his headquarters here in Neff, and he had to have troops all the way to Majoret and all the way to Longville. And if you ever get a chance to go over and drive these roads, they're pretty much the same as what you would have seen in 1944. Now also artillery. Here's the thing, people don't realize that artillery was really the reason why Bastogne was held. You can say the 101st Airborne, obviously they had manpower, it was a whole division. 10th Armored only had a combat command. But Lieutenant Colonel Barry Brown was the commander of the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. And every veteran I talked about said that he was one of those foxhole generals, or colonels, excuse me. He would actually get later on a commission. But Lieutenant Colonel Barry Brown would go foxhole to foxhole and half-track to half-track and artillery piece to artillery piece and check in on the men. He wasn't one of those leaders who would just be standing in the background not being available. He would literally go and check on every man. Unfortunately, that actually became detrimental to him. So this is Team Brown out in Saint-Auchamp. If you get a chance to go to Saint-Auchamp, you blink and you miss it. It's a very, really tiny little village. But this is where the artillery would set up to really do a 360-degree artillery bombardment all around Bastogne itself. And, of course, can't talk about the Battle of Bastogne without talking about Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe, of course, was a one-star general. He was only in Bastogne, really, because General Taylor was back in the United States for the Christmas holiday. So McAuliffe, really, he was kind of green himself. He wasn't really a big-time fighter, but he really took control of the situation. He had to deal with not only his 101st Airborne Division, but he had to deal with remnants of the 9th Armored, remnants of the 28th Division. He had to deal with the Combat Command B. So he had really a managerial nightmare at that point. But, of course, we know him from his famous reply of nuts, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. What I like to do is give you before and after pictures, things that you can actually see. So this is actually right when the Bulge is starting. This is actually a photo taken by the 796th Armored Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion of the 10th Armored Division. You can see there's civilians being led out of Bastogne right over here. And you can actually see here's a tanker kind of waving them out there. But this is kind of as you're coming into McAuliffe Square in Bastogne itself. Rue de Viviers. Again, you can see you've got your trucks set up. And, of course, the civilians are just walking around. They're doing their everyday lives. Of course, Once the artillery starts coming in, though, their lives become pretty much cellar dwellers in the city of Bastogne. And here's a Team Snafu headquarters. I don't think I really need to tell you what snafu means, but as one veteran said, situation normal, all fouled up. But this is it's actually looks like a little garage now in Bastogne. That was Team Snafu. That was a group of 9th Armored, 28th Division, stragglers from all over who they consolidated into a fire control squad. So they were on pretty much watch. If there was a line that needs to be plugged or a situation that was forming, they would literally be ready to jump in there and fight at a moment's notice. And of course, Rue de Clairvaux, which you can actually see the church steeple right here. And this is actually a great photo. This is actually Bastogne right in the middle of the siege. There was a medic who was in the thick of it who actually took a ton of photos in Bastogne because he did work at the headquarters for CCB, which is actually now an Asian restaurant in Bastogne. You can actually still go visit. It was actually called the Hotel Le Brun during that time. But yes, you can kind of start to see there's a lot of damage going on in Bastogne itself when this photo was taken. I believe it was taken around 22nd or 23rd of December. So of course we talked about the plan, the situation, what the Germans wanted to do going through Belgium. And this kind of gives you that a good sense of the plan of attack. This is of course once your 506 parachute infantry regiment of the 101st Airborne and Team Desiree start to fight together. They are able to hold off the German army for long enough, but they actually wanted to withdraw and come back to Bastogne. But Roberts told them, his orders were, you have to stay and fight until we fully get the 101st Airborne to come down. Now this right here, this is Phil Burge. He's still alive today. He lives down in Washington, D.C. He was actually part of the 55th Armored Engineer Battalion for the 10th Armored Division. This is actually his photograph post-war. And Phil actually has a great story to tell about his...
The next morning, my friend Flash and I were told to go to the headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division.
And actually, before we... this is actually his first... just want to get some clarity. His first meeting with General McAuliffe. So he actually got to see McAuliffe right before the 101st officially came in.
They could help us get some supplies. When we went to the 101st Airborne, we went into the office of General McAuliffe. And you can imagine what he was involved in. This was the morning of December 19th, 1944. And you can see him pictured at the head of a long table with his aides surrounded on both sides, a lot of maps, and the defense of Bastogne would be underway. Right? Wrong. General McAuliffe was chewing out some paratrooper. Apparently, this kerchief that he had around his neck wasn't tied properly. And my friend Flash and I looked at each other and sort of rolled our eyes, but after all, he was a one-star general. And little did we know that a few days later he would be a national hero. But we sort of thought, who is this guy anyway, you know?
So, of course, Phil Burge got to see General McAuliffe before his nuts proclamation. But you can see, again, McAuliffe sounded like he was very much, just like Henry Cherry, very much a by-the-book type of general. So, December 20th, things are starting to look actually really poor for our Team Desiree. They have the 101st Airborne with them, but they're starting to lose some of their commanders. So Desiree himself gets wounded by an 88 round that goes through their headquarters. Colonel Prade of the 101st Airborne is actually killed by the 88. Desbris is actually, they tried to evacuate him out of Noville, but by the time they get him out of his headquarters, he's actually captured by the Germans and spends the rest of the war in a POW camp. So at this point, Major Husted takes over for Desbris, and he is told, we need to withdraw. Now the problem is, the German army has started to not only overtake Noville, but they are starting to outflank the 101st Airborne and Team Husted. And at that point, they almost got all of them captured on their way back to the town of Foy. So now we're going south to Team O'Hara. So O'Hara, he has really this big problem right here. We talked about the Wiltz Road. So the Germans just start storming down this road, even though there are roadblocks set up. It's just too many German tanks to too few 10th Armored tanks. The 327th Glider Battalion are coming in. They are a major player during this battle. But our tankers here for the 10th Armored do score a few hits. Don Nichols, he was C Company, 21st Tank Battalion. He was in what we call a Sherman tank, but it had a tank destroyer, a 105, or an artillery actually, barrel on it, a 105. So it was packed quite a punch. And Don actually faced down a Tiger tank early on in the Battle of the Bulge.
So we went to Bastogne, through Bastogne into the front at that time, which was close to Ardennes, Belgium. We set up a position on a point area close to Colonel O'Hara's command post, just in front of that. We were in front of his command post and the enemy positions. Now then, as that morning when the day broke, there was a heavy fog, and the fog would raise and go down. Well, it would raise, and the tank in front of me, which was a forward observer's tank, burst into flame. The tank to my left was backing up, and I got a hit, and the driver was killed. So they evacuated and came towards us, and of course they knew nothing about what was happening. But as I stayed in our tank with the rest of the crew, the assistant gunner thought he would jump out and see if he could help anybody in the burning tank. Well, it was too late for that, and he came back, and we yelled at him to come back to get into his position, which was a loader for the 105 that was on my tank. The 105 had the power, but it was only a 5-bag shell, so it did not have the speed that the 105s with 7 bags had. And I kept searching through my 30 caliber scope, 30 scope, and finally saw this tank pull out, fire around, and pull back into the piney woods. The piney woods was his hiding place at that time. And I told my tank commander, and the guy could not identify where he was coming from. So he pulled out another time and fired at something to my right, which was probably more of our troops. The tank commander still could not identify, and he said, "Fire at your discretion." So I decided that approximately, being a football player, it was about 600 yards in front of me. And so when he pulled up again, I fired an HE round. The first one was short. So he pulled back in again, the Tiger did, or the German tank anyway. I thought it was a Tiger. And pretty soon he came back out, and I was ready for him again. And I fired again, and I hit one of the trees, a piney tree trunk, and it ricocheted off of that. He went immediately pulled back into the piney woods where I could not see him. At that time, the fog was going up and down, and he came back out, and I fired again, and the tank commander still had not been able to identify what I was shooting at, but this one ricocheted off of his tank. It did not explode, which was amazing to me because it was a high explosive setting. So another time he did the same thing, and I missed again, or I didn't miss, I was just a little off short. So I readjusted my scopes for a little more distance. He came out again, I told the loader to put a heat round in, and he did, and I hit him frontal. And I saw black smoke come up, but in the meantime he was backing up. So that kind of, I felt that he had been disabled. And this was later confirmed by a tank destroyer that came up.
Okay. So Don Nichols actually, get it to come up here. He actually drew a diagram right after the battle of what he saw, which, as a researcher, this is the stuff I love. I mean, he actually showed you. He showed, of course, the forward observer tank. Of course, that was on fire. Talked about the other tank that was knocked out. And then here's his tank. And then, of course, there's the Tiger tank. So at first I'm thinking, well, this is a great drawing. Well, how can I put this into today's terms? Well, there it is on a nice Google map. I was able to go to the spot. It was actually winter. Unfortunately, there was a fence, and I didn't know if it was electrified or not, so I wasn't going to test fate to jump in. I wanted to. But again, you can see here's, of course, the observer tank. Roughly where that stone wall is that he indicated would have been right about here. The other tank that was knocked out, here's Don's tank, and then there's where the Tiger would have been. So this is where, we think of military history, especially Civil War, Revolutionary War, and how things have changed. Well, when you go to Belgium and Luxembourg, a lot of it hasn't changed. You're able to actually see and walk in those footsteps. And that's what history is all about, actually going to the places where these events took place and getting a feel for it. And that's where history can become a passion. So just an idea. This is a M4 Sherman 105. And ironically, it actually it has 10th Armored Markings on it, 21st Tank Battalion. So I've got to figure out where the heck that is, because it came from a French website, so I'm wondering if it is in France. And this, of course, is your Tiger tank. And if anyone gets a chance to rent the movie Fury with Brad Pitt in it, it actually has a real Tiger tank. One of the first times, I think, a real Tiger tank was used in a theatrical release. And you get a good idea in that movie of what it was like to face down one of those Tiger tanks. So again, we talked about Team O'Hara. Of course, the next day on December 20th, they're starting to have to pull back as well. The holding action by CCB is really that. It's a holding action. They're not supposed to be going on the offensive, even though Team Desabry tried to. But they're really there to hold so that we continue to get more reinforcements coming in. And the situation is starting to get worse. As you can see from here, this is the German line. It's starting to get a little bit tight. And as the wounded are coming through from Marvy and, of course, up in Noville when they came down, they're able to get through the lines, but that is starting to get less and less likely for the Tigers. And of course, December 22nd, nuts. So this is the actual typed up document of the German almost ultimatum of you need to surrender, which was very confusing because at first, when the 101st Airborne saw this, they said, oh, that's great, the Germans want to surrender. This is excellent. And then, of course, when they hand this document, and they say, wait, you're asking us to surrender? What do you mean? So when this gets back to McAuliffe, of course, McAuliffe is sitting there saying, are you kidding me? And now there's lots of stories about what he actually said. Maybe some of it was a little profane, but he did say nuts. I mean, we know that. He said, nuts. And when he was asked, what should our reply be? And he said, well, I don't really know. And of course, one of his underlings said, well, why don't we just say nuts? What the heck? Now, when they gave this to the Germans, they had no idea what that meant. Nuts, what the heck does that mean? Because, of course, it's a little slang. So that's really why nuts became such a battle cry. It spread across the entire CCB area, and of course later on gets into the media. And it really galvanizes what the defenders of Bastogne are there to do. They're there to hold on and not let the Germans overrun the town itself. So, December 23rd, officially surrounded. Bastogne is cut off. The wounded cannot get out. And supplies, ammunition, medical, it's not coming in again. So now CCB, members of the 101st, stragglers from the 28th, they are all on their own. So just like how the CCB was, Combat Command B earlier, where they were out in the line by themselves, well now, the defenders of Bastogne, they're it. But something great happens.
On the morning of the 23rd of December, as I recall, and this was an act of God, and I always thought this was my reward for going to church on the previous Tuesday, because the skies miraculously cleared. It was very heavy overcast, which it is almost invariably, but the skies cleared, and we could see these C-47s coming over, dropping supplies, and this was a moment that I will always remember, that we're probably going to survive after all.
So Phil Burge was right. The airdrop was really a godsend. It was a miracle. The entire Bastogne corridor had been socked in by clouds and fog, and finally it cleared out. And not only were C-47s coming in, but P-47s and P-51s started to come in and really start strafing German positions. So the tide started to finally turn on December 23rd. But even Christmas Eve wasn't really that festive. They were still surrounded. They had gotten some supplies, but they were still very much low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. And Phil Burge even told me his Christmas dinner was cheese and crackers, which actually he could be pretty thankful for that. But this is where this lady comes in. Lady Augusta Chewy. She actually volunteered to work in the aid station for the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 10th Armored Division. She was a trained nurse. She was actually from the Belgian Congo, and her family actually lived in Bastogne. She had just come by right before the start of the Battle of the Bulge to be with her family for Christmas. So, wrong place, wrong time. Lady Augusta actually never was given the due recognition from not only the Belgians, but also not only the Americans, until my co-author Martin King pretty much went on a one-man crusade to get her knighthood. That is why she is Lady. And also she received awards from the United States government and from the 101st Airborne. And sadly, Augusta passed away a few years ago, but if you ever got to meet her, she literally was this tall. She was a little wisp of a thing. But not only was she a nurse taking care of soldiers who had battle wounds that she could only imagine as being a regular nurse in Louvain, up in north of Bastogne. But she actually also went out on the battlefield. At one point, the 101st Airborne, they had some wounded soldiers out near the Mardesan Hill, which is right now a giant monument in Bastogne. And she actually helped pull off a soldier who had gotten wounded. Ironically, she actually almost got shot. But as Jack Pryor, the battalion surgeon for the 20th Armored Infantry, commented, they said, well, you know, Augusta, you're so small, they just couldn't hit you. And of course, Augusta said, what, this black face and the white snow? They were just bad shots. So Dr. Jack Pryor, he was the battalion surgeon for the 20th Armored Infantry. He was actually up in Nouville, taking care of the wounded up there. He came back into Bastogne, set up an aid station, and it was actually on December 24th that the aid station was destroyed by German bombing. The German Luftwaffe finally kind of woke up after the skies cleared as well, and they started bombing all of Bastogne, including the aid station that they ran. This is a picture of the last time they met each other in 1994 for the 50th anniversary. Irving Lee Naftalin, he was actually a dentist. He was the dental officer for the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion. He also was taking care of the wounded. Now, you got to think he's a dentist. He deals with, you know, teeth problems and maybe sutures and stuff like that, but he was helping with the different casualties and really being a helping another hand for Dr. Jack Pryor. And Nurse Renee Lemaire, if you've seen Band of Brothers. Anyone here seen Band of Brothers? Yes? Okay. Well, she is featured, of course, in the Bastogne episode, but this is where Stephen Ambrose kind of took a little bit of Hollywood changing in the story. She actually never knew Doc Rowe, who was featured in Band of Brothers. Really, the story is she knew Dr. Naftalin and Jack Pryor. So that's actually the real story. But Stephen Ambrose decided to Hollywoodize it for his miniseries. But Nurse Renee Lemaire, she was a native of Bastogne. She volunteered as well. Naftalin actually found her when he went around the town looking for medical help. And she was actually killed on December 24th. She was in the aid station when it was bombed. Both her and Augusta are actually both buried in Bastogne, and you can go visit their graves today. This is actually a photograph from Lee Naftalin's collection. He took a photo of the aid station the day after and put a little, you can just kind of see it right here, little arrow, and it says, Bastogne, where I got it. He also was wounded, really suffered a major concussion and some other smaller wounds, but once the building got hit, he actually went into the rubble and brought out 4 survivors out of the building itself. This is actually a photograph of several German prisoners of war helping clean up the rubble several days after the bombing. So Christmas wasn't really the merriest of Christmases, especially for the paratroopers and the tankers out in the front lines. But this is Heinz Barracks, where the 101st Airborne headquarters was. And, of course, we have General McAuliffe right here, and they're enjoying a nice Christmas spread. And this is actually Colonel William Roberts. He was also invited to the Christmas dinner that day. So the 25th, again, they are still surrounded, but the 4th Armored Division is coming. Patton is on his way, but the German army starts to also launch a major counterattack to try to break the defenders of Bastogne. This is W.D. Krittenberger. He became actually the battalion commander after Colonel Barry Brown, who we showed you earlier, was killed. He died of his wounds on Christmas Day during an attack by the German forces on the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. Now, Krittenberger, he comes from armored royalty. His father actually was the head of the 2nd Armored Division during right around World War I. 26, finally, relief. The 4th Armored have arrived. So they come in from the south, and there still is a pillbox in Bastogne, outside of Bastogne, that you can still see today. That was where the 4th Armored first made their first attack to knock out the German soldiers who were in that pillbox as they broke through the lines. Now, many 101st Airborne soldiers and veterans, of course, later said, oh, we didn't need Patton to come through. Well, they kind of did. They needed ambulances, they needed medics, they needed supplies. And that's what happens on December 26th. The siege of Bastogne is broken, but the battle is not done. The battle to push the German army back to the Siegfried Line is the next part of our story. And of course, there's our man, General Patton, and General McAuliffe. So I wanted to really just talk about the legacy. What is over here in Belgium that you can still see today about the 10th Armored Division? This is actually a tank turret. It's actually right near, on your way to the Martessan Monument. And the 10th Armored Division Western Chapter got together, raised some money, and put a plaque next to this tank turret, which is just sitting out in the middle of the road. No one really knew what it was, but we decided to put a nice plaque to remind the citizens of Bastogne and visitors about what happened with the 10th Armored during the siege. We also have, in the main square, there's an 11th Armored Division tank, which actually was incorrectly labeled a 4th Armored Division tank for a long time. There's actually a little, let's see if we can, right over here, we have no idea who put this here, but a nice little 10th Armored plaque was put right at the base of this tank. And also the Bastogne Historical Center, which has just been totally revamped, which is really worth the price of admission. There is a 10th Armored Division 3rd Tank Battalion tank, which actually Major William Desabry, when he was then General Desabry, raised money to bring that tank to Bastogne to be on display. It was actually outside for a long time, but they finally put it inside the museum to be preserved for the rest of time. But with that, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you again to our veterans.
I'm going to just briefly reintroduce each of the veterans we have here tonight. So starting over here with then Captain Bob Rupp, Service Battery Commander with the 3rd Armored Field Artillery Battalion that was assigned to the 9th Armored Division, AKA tonight, his handle is going to be Phantom, and he'll tell us about that in a little bit. Next, we've got, it was Corporal, Tech 4, Wayne DeHaven with the 17th Airborne. He was a radio man for the company commander, lugging that extra weight up and down, paratrooper, combat wounded. I think it was January 7 is what we figured it was. And he's got some stories to tell. Then over here, we've got a Fallschirmjäger, Gunter Diersen, with the 9th Regiment of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, and he fought in the northern shoulder, infiltrated in on the 1st day, combat wounded on the 5th or the 6th day, and he'll tell his story. And then, I got to go back here. So this is Talon, Golden Talon from the 17th Airborne, Jaeger from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, and now we go down to Tiger. And Mr. Bud Hellman was a Tech 5, was a tank driver, or it was a tank destroyer that he was on with the 9th Armored Division, and of course their handle was Tiger. I'm sorry, the 9th down here, the 10th down here. I'm already off my sheet. Let's go back to our scripts, everybody. So as a guy that was on tanks and loved tanks, driving around tanks, and when the crew's all together, it's a sweet thing. Tell us about your ride during World War II. What were you on, Tiger?
Well, I was on a M18 tank destroyer. For most people call them tanks anyway, but they had a lot more speed, and they had a 76 millimeter gun, so they had a lot of power, and they had a wonderful suspension system, so it was really a very easy ride. You probably wouldn't expect that, and it had a Continental air-cooled engine in the back, which give off a lot of heat, so the motor was in the back. So if you climbed up on top of that in the hot or in the cold weather, there was a lot of nice heat coming out of there. That was very appreciated a lot of times.
And I understand it's all steel track, so it's maybe a little rough ride, but you could open that thing up to 50 miles an hour on the road. Not saying that you did that, but you could open that thing up. Next, we're going to go over and we're going to talk to Talon. And how did you join the paratroopers? What motivated you to join the paratroopers? I heard it was a certain magazine.
Yes, I seen a bunch of paratroopers in the Life magazine. That's when I was a young kid.
Yeah, and the extra pay, what, $50 a month extra pay?
$50 a month we got for jumping.
That's pretty good. And how many jumps total did you have?
13 jumps.
And all safely. Everything worked fine.
Everything worked fine.
That is fantastic. We're glad that you're here tonight. Now we're going to go to Jaeger. You joined a unit, and why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into the German Army, because you were in Denmark at the time.
Well, I was a German citizen, and you know, Germany occupied Denmark, so they controlled everything. And when I was 18, they actually gave me, when I was 17, in Germany they had shortened the high school to 17. But since I was in Denmark and I was in a Danish school, they allowed me an extra year, so I was 18, but then they drafted me. And they drafted me actually to the Air Force. I had thought, well, Navy I didn't want to, and infantry I really didn't want to, but it would be nice to fly, so I said I wanted to be in the Air Force. And I got a blue uniform, a very nice, chic blue uniform, but they didn't have any gasoline to fly anymore. All the airplanes were standing on the airfields at the sides without flying. So instead of putting me into flying, they put me into a parachute division that had been shut up in Normandy, and so I was allowed to fill in there. And so I was in there. We never had that fancy outfit that he was showing there. No. I had a standard blue uniform, and of course we moved a little bit around. The last one before we came into the frontier area was actually up in Holland, in Hengelo. We were there for a little training, and at that time they were afraid the Allied might land over there and do some damage, so we had to lay in the countryside. You asked me the other day what was my most memorable event, and my most memorable event was actually when we came on a rail. We were always something like 40 guys in a cattle car, and we moved around on the railroad. But we came to Hengelo in Holland, and they had taken some schools that we should now occupy and live in. And you come in and there's nothing there, only straw on the floor. And I thought, that's bleak to be here. We don't know how long, but it's bleak to have nothing but straw on the floor. So I looked around and found a billiard table, a wonderful billiard table standing in one of the sheds. It wasn't a shed, it was the outskirt of the school. So I got, we were about 10 guys, so I got them all. It was a heavy billiard table, so we were trying to move this to our room. But we didn't get very far. The Royal Air Force bombed the school to smithereens. And all of a sudden, boom, and the bombs were falling and the walls were falling down. But I dived under the heavy table. So I was laying there, and the whole school was laying on top of me, on the top of the table. So we could make it out again. So I think that was the worst experience, kind of, that I... Actually, every time we went someplace, somebody bombed us.
So you're a paratrooper that has never jumped, but you're always getting bombed. That's what we got. Good. We're going to move down to Phantom down here on the end. And sir, I'd like you to tell us how your unit got the nickname Phantom and then what kind of equipment you had.
An armored division has 3 combat commands, A, B, and reserve. Each one has a battalion of artillery, a battalion of infantry, and a battalion of tanks. The 9th Armored Division was the only division on the line when the Bulge started. The Bulge was 87 miles long. We were on the south shoulder near Luxembourg City. I was in CCA, Service Battery Commander of the 3rd Field Artillery Battalion of the 9th Armored. CCB was up on the north end around St. Vith and Malmedy, which did a lot of fighting up there in the Herdgen Forest. CCR was straight east of Bastogne, and the Germans ran into the 9th Armored in about 3 different places about the same time, and they gave us the name of the Phantom 9th, which is a book about the Phantom 9th that's written quite a while ago. I came into service in 1941, June 10. I saw the World War II coming when I was going into my junior year in college, so I took ROTC Advance and was lucky to be assigned to an old professional, long-time outfit that has its history all the way back to the Revolutionary War. They were professional soldiers. We had a very good West Point CO during the war. Not all West Pointers were good, but this one was good. And he made sure he knew his job, and he made sure we knew our job. And that was pretty important on the 16th of December, 1944, when the Bulge started.
So now we're going to talk just a little bit about your unit, the kind of equipment, and how prepared you were. And starting with you, Talon, you told us you'd had 13 jumps. Can you tell us where you did all those jumps at, stateside, and then as you moved to Europe?
Down in Fort Benning, Georgia, jump school. Our division, 17th Airborne, at that time was the 13th Airborne. Then they started the 17th, put us in that. And as a division, we went through jump school. Those that wanted to be paratroopers and glider people took care of gliders.
Did you believe that all the stuff they had in the Life magazine was true after you'd gone through Benning?
Yes, I found out it was very true.
You told me that you didn't really care for Sunday evenings too much. Why is that?
Pardon?
Sunday evenings.
Well, Sunday evening was always cold cuts night for supper in the service with our outfits.
Otherwise, the chow was pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go down to Tiger. You did some training stateside. Tell us a little bit about your replacement in your unit, and maybe about from high school how they trained you and how they used you.
Well, I was still in high school when I was drafted. I was 18 in February, so I had to sign up for the draft right away. And when you put your name in the hat, and I was called out the first month. So I ended up taking a physical right away in March, but then they didn't call me up until June, and they didn't call any of the other guys up. But I trained in Camp Campbell, Kentucky. Wrong. Camp Hood in Texas. And after 17 weeks of training, then we were sent out to Fort Meade, and that was on Thanksgiving Day of '44. But lucky for me, they wanted infantrymen in Europe more than they wanted tank destroyers. So we got held up in Fort Meade for 2 months, which was lucky because some of the guys that I went into the infantry, one of them was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Bulge. So it was very lucky. Otherwise, if I'd have went over the same way they did, I would have been in at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge and still at the end of it.
Thank you, Tiger. We're going to move on to, it's December 16th, 1944. The element of surprise the Wehrmacht has achieved. Allied forces kind of expected not too much. It was going to be kind of a recovery area. But at that time, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division was moving into position. Can you tell us a little bit about the things the night before on the 15th and then into the 16th of December, how operations unfolded for your unit?
Well, as I said, we were all on foot. And actually, we were up in Düren, Aachen, which was surrounded by the Allied forces, and they were shooting a little in there, and they had bombed it to the level that you could stand and see all over the city. But anyhow, it was reasonably peaceful, actually. There was not too much that happened. Yeah, they were shooting a little with artillery and things like that, but it was relatively peaceful. So all of a sudden, we get the order to march off. And we get replaced by some old guys that come in, you know, Folks Grenadiers or something. They were at least 40, 50 years old, and they moved in and took our position. And we were marching only at night. And every night, we had no idea where we went, but every night we went. And in the morning, we slept in the farms. And that went all pretty good. You know, you get thick skin on your feet. So one could march, and one never took the boots off because it was such a job to take them on and off. So one just slept with the boots on. And that went on for a couple of days. I would say about a little week. And then all of a sudden one morning, that was the 16th, we were called on to, it was 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, and they read a big bulletin about now we were going to the battle. And so we went into the battle, just across a line there. Across the line, we went into the battle, and what do you do? I mean, there were some Allied Americans that had a few guns lined up, and they were shooting at the others, and we were kind of ducking, and then we were shooting a little. we heard what I said before. All of a sudden we heard, and they left. They took their guns along and went back. So we went forward. It was pretty nice. There was nobody there shooting at us for a while. And so we went, and this Battle of the Bulge, you were supposed to dig foxholes, which is you dig a hole, a small narrow hole that you can kind of stay in if somebody comes, a tank or whatever comes by. Anyhow, it was so cold and everything was frozen. It was impossible to dig any fast. So we were laying in the middle of the wood there and trying to get a little sleep, and nothing much happened. Then we marched on, and actually there was not all that much. We marched along the road. You always are in information somehow. That's the only way they can control you. So one goes here, there's one ahead, and everybody tells you exactly what to do. And we came through. That was an early morning. I think the next day, that was the 16th, the 17th, early morning. We came marching along the road, and there was quite a few jeeps standing there, and some guys just tried to, they started, and then well, that was interesting. Since we didn't have any order to go with jeeps, we walked on, and I also saw a few shadows in the side of the road there, but nobody gave any orders, so we marched on. And by the time we were through the village, and quite a bit through, all of a sudden we got fire from the back. They had been sleeping, the Americans had been sleeping in the basements of the farmhouses. And they were surprised, of course, to see German soldiers march through. And we didn't get any order to attack or look at the basements of the farmhouses. So we marched right through, but then somebody turned around and they sent them off to prison camp. So that was not very, very much. And actually, what we were interested in was sea rations. They had ruined our, already up in Holland, they had ruined our kitchen. So we were dependent on finding things to eat. And I was very good at that. And I found some sea rations, and they were delicious. There was chocolate in there and everything. So we had a good time with those.
That's for a cooking class next month. I'm gonna move down here to Phantom, and if you can tell us, your unit kept pretty good discipline. We always hear that the Americans were sleeping or something, but your unit did some pretty important things, and you guys were not caught off guard.
Well, on the south end of the bulge, I think it started at 5:30. I've read several books, and most of the time they were saying 5:30 when it kicked off. And it was about 35 degrees. It was a foggy, rainy morning. You couldn't see more than 100 yards. I got up to battalion headquarters by 6 or a little before, and we were firing missions. I don't know how our forward observers could see anybody, but they were, and we were firing missions. And we were about 15, 20 miles outside of Luxembourg City, northeast of there. And the Germans knew exactly where we were. They had, I think, they had people that were civilians who were reporting back to them because they knew where our infantry was. They knew where our tanks were. They didn't know where artillery that I was in was because we had moved just by happenstance from Konsdorf Luxembourg to Haller to get better gun positions. We still took about 800 to 900 rounds in the first hour during there, but they weren't exactly on target during that time. And then we were there for 10 days, and we were firing, we fired about 26,000 rounds during those 10 days. If you figure that out, it's about 1 round every 40 seconds. Now, we didn't fire that, we fired in bursts. We were firing when we weren't doing a mission. We were firing into approach areas. And we found out that we were up against a German infantry division, and we denied them access to Luxembourg City and established the south shoulder of the Bulge. And while I got the mic, somebody mentioned Thanksgiving on the 1944. Officers got rations, liquor rations that the enlisted men didn't get, which I never quite agreed with, but we saved it in my battery. And on Thanksgiving Day, we spiked the grapefruit juice, and everybody got about 3/4 of a canteen cup of that spiked juice, and I couldn't have moved my battery that afternoon if I'd have had to.
Phantom, thanks for that story. I did not get that in our previous interview, and so that one's, I'm writing that one down. That's a good one. But the event you're talking about, where you fired on the 267th Volksgrenadier Division while they're in attack?
It was a 276th.
Okay, can you tell us?
I told you wrong. It was a 276th Volksgrenadier Division, and I'll tell you more about it later, but...
Let's do that right now. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me recollect here. After we had been in that 10 days there, we turned around and we're going back to a rest camp, I thought. Instead, we got turned around at Neufchâteau and attacked to relieve Bastogne. But the story we're talking about now is the 276th. After the 10 days, our battalion commander put us in for an award. We got turned down because we hadn't lost enough men. We only lost 13 men in combat during the entire war. I lost one out of my battery who was shot by a sniper in a church steeple one evening. Anyway, after the war was over, when Russia collapsed, they found German daily battle reports somewhere in the archives in Russia. Is this thing gone dead? No, it's okay. Okay. And so they found the daily battle reports from the commanding general of the 276th. It's okay. And so we added that material. He had said that they couldn't get past their first phase line. They were trying to get into Luxembourg City, which was a rail and communication center, and they couldn't get past their first day's objective. So we resubmitted and added this material from the German report and got the Presidential Unit Citation. Now, that's a nice award, and I'm glad we got it, but the one I was really proud of was a Merit Unit Award, the second one down, which my battery received for about 6 months of activity before the Bulge, all through the rest of the war.
What's interesting about World War II, when we take a look at it, about 70% of the casualties were from artillery fire. That goes all the way from naval gunfire down to mortars, and it's very devastating. That causes the most casualties on the battlefield. And as we take a look to you, Talon, You came in later. You guys were transversing across the Atlantic. You went to England, and then they put you in the line in order to push the bulge back from where it started from. Can you tell us about the day in which your patrol was ambushed?
Well, we were coming down a hill towards the woods. And we did see a house and a barn there, and we thought, oh, that's a farmhouse. Next thing we knew, we were being shelled on. So we had to shell back, and that was my part, was just about my end, because that's when I got wounded. The mortar or air grenade, I don't know what it was, landed in front of me. And my radio saved my life because it cuts the radio right straight in half like a knife. And I could see the guys carrying it in two pieces away from me, and they carried me to a Jeep and took me back.
And so you were medically evacuated from the battlefield, and you recovered in England initially?
Well, I was in Belgium first at a hospital, I think. I don't know for sure because, but then from there I went to another regular hospital, and then I went to England, and then from England I went to Iowa, and from Iowa I went up to Michigan. That's where I was discharged from.
And they gave you an 80% disability rating for that, and you said you still have some shrapnel?
Yes, I have shrapnel in the back of my head yet, by my shoulder blades down in there and down towards the buttocks.
Now your lovely wife Dolores is here with you tonight, correct?
Pardon?
Your wife is here with you tonight?
Yes.
Yes. Doesn't she tell you we need to get out more? And sometimes she says, get the lead out. Is that true?
She always tells me that.
Good, good. That's what 71 years of marriage will do for you. Honesty.
Right.
Okay, so we're talking about wounds here, and we're talking about artillery fire and shrapnel, and your day came somewhere around the 21st or 22nd of December?
22nd, I think I said already, we were going across. Actually, the 101st Airborne was laying up there and shooting at us, but they couldn't quite hit us because we were in a low point. But then they started the mortars, and of course they got me. I have just explained that. But it was such luck for me because we were on the attack, and everybody was ready to help me back. I had two guys holding my hand and sliding me on my back. One guy was supporting by just running at my leg that I held up in the air, and I think there was 4 or something like that helping me back, all the way back to the first farmhouse basement where I could kind of relax a little bit, relax. I still had my steel helmet on, and I actually kept my steel helmet on. I didn't think about it, until I came to the first hospital unit where the Americans were there. And I was feeling in my back of my neck, and it was kind of sticky, and there was blood on my hand when I walked. So I rubbed over my steel helmet, and there was a square hole in it. Then I had to start thinking very hard. So I was, and it was kind of difficult to get that thing off because it had bent into my skull. But I got it off, and they came and shaved it and put a little bandage on, and that was it. Until I had an accident, a car accident here in Minnesota, and they x-rayed my skull. They said, there's metal on top of it. Then I said, well, didn't ricochet. But don't worry, it has been there for 30, 40 years. It will probably stay.
Is that possibly the first hair transplant? Is that what that is? Maybe. Looks good. We're going to move back over here to Phantom, and you were awarded a Bronze Star Medal with a Valor device. Can you tell us a little bit about the actions surrounding that?
Okay. The first day of the war, or by the Bulge, started on the 16th, I think, maybe the 17th. Well, I know when it started, but on this action was either the 16th or the 17th. I took some ammunition up to Battery B, which was at a T road near Hull, and we didn't know it going in, but we were under fire from a patch of woods about 400 yards away from them, and so we got in there and got the ammunition unloaded, and I was walking across the courtyard of this farmstead. German Bavarian farmsteads were kind of in a circle with an open place in the center, and then the houses and the barn and so forth together, and the guns were just outside of the circle, and the battery commander, Les Green, was in the basement of the house across the road. As I was walking across the center part of it, I drew a mortar fire and was huddled up next to the edge of a little stone fence for a little bit. And then when it lifted, I went on over to Les and said that you're under observation if somebody can see right into this farmstead. And why don't you put some direct fire on that patch of woods over there about 400 yards north of you, because I think that's where it's coming from. And he said, I'm just taking fire missions. And so I said, well, okay, can I do it? He said, be my guest. So I called Mock, his exec officer at the guns, and I said, when you're not doing a mission, do some direct fire on that patch of woods over there. And so Mock did, and fired a few point-blank rounds, high explosives hitting in the trees, just maybe 10 feet up and spraying down. And we lifted the fire, and then, and this kind of admits I'm not very bright, but I walked out in front of the house with one of my men who could speak German, and had him yell over there that we would hold our fire if any Germans wanted to surrender. I think 4 of them, maybe 6 of them, but I think 4 of them come running out of the woods. And the Germans shot 2 of them, but 2 of them got back to me, and I turned them in to S2 because this was the first day, and I figured that we needed some G2 information and turn them into S2 and go on back to G2 to find out what we were in, because at this point we had no idea that this was 87 miles long and that we were part of a real thrust by the Germans to break through all the way to the coast.
Thank you. We're going to go over to Tiger. Tiger, you got, once you arrived and were inculcated into the unit, you told me that you were a repo depot or a repo depot, and how were you treated by the unit when you came in?
Oh, I always felt we were treated real well. Like, so one of my friends that came over the same time as me one time said he didn't think the guys paid much attention to us until we got into some combat on an outpost, and after that they figured we were part of them.
And then those guys trained you up to look at different things on the battlefield, and you had one of your first actions, and you guys captured some POWs. What was your impression of the POWs when you captured them?
Well, there was quite a lot of people surrendering in those days, and I noticed that some of them, when they loaded them up in 6x6 trucks, and they just packed them in there standing up. But some of them were probably only about 14 years old or that. So I guess that was kind of common at the end of the war. One time we were driving up the Autobahn, and all of a sudden there must have been hundreds of all coming together, marching together that had surrendered. It was so funny because I didn't see anybody guarding them, and as we got up to the end of them, we went one way, almost ignored them, and they were going the other way. And there at the end was one M20, and I looked, and there was two guys that I knew that were in that M20, and they were escorting them back to the word. So there was like 4 or 5 guys escorting about hundreds, but they were wanting to surrender in those days.
Combat does different things to different people, and sometimes we have, we call it shell shock or combat fatigue or PTSD, and being able to deal with the situation becomes difficult. You had an instance, Phantom, in your unit. Can you explain what happened and what you guys did to bring them back around?
On the first morning of the 16th, as I said, I got into battalion headquarters, Fire Direction Center, about 6 o'clock or a little before, and everybody's busy. We're taking missions and everybody's working except the battalion XO, who was a major. He was sitting on the end of a bench with his hands on his knees, rocking back and forth, and says, oh my God, oh, what are we going to do? And that was my first experience of seeing anybody with, I don't know what you call it, combat disability, I guess. And he got over it. He worked out fine later. He stayed with us. And the other one experience I had with it was when I took the ammunition into B battery, and we'd had the mortar fire coming in right into the inside of this farmstead. One of my truck drivers, as I got back ready to go back out, went over to him and he said, Captain Rupp, I can't run this truck out of here. I said, you can't? You know, what do you do now? We got a man. So I talked to him. And I said, oh, yes, you can. I'm going to rev up my Jeep and I'm going out of here. It's lickety split as fast as it'll go, and I want you to rev up your truck and do the same thing. And we got these 2 prisoners. I'm going to put one on the passenger side in the truck cab with you, and the enemy's firing from over in that patch of woods. If they hit anybody, they're going to hit him. But I want you to wind her up as fast as she'll go, and we had about a quarter of a mile of exposure. That's all it took. And he was a good man from this on. And I'd never had any other experience with that, but I think it's something that can happen to anybody, and I don't think you'll know until it happens to you whether or not you might be one of the people that can't function for a short time. But both these people did function later on.
Going back to Tiger, you had a very interesting first time driving across the Rhine River. Can you tell us what time of day it was, what you were driving, and what kind of great engineering marvel you drove across on?
You know, I never ever mentioned it to anybody except here a few years ago, but I did drive an M18 across the Rhine on a pontoon bridge at Worms. And we drove across, of course, in the dark at night. And so all you do is you see if you can see the little cat eyes from the vehicle in front of you. So that was it sounds like a big deal to drive across the Rhine on the pontoon bridge, but really a much bigger deal, I think, is the guys that built that pontoon bridge in the first place for us.
I've got to say, doing that at night, not really seeing the vehicle ahead of you, that I've been in that type of situation before, but not across the Rhine. And I think you also told me it was 2-man crew at that time. You had the tank commander and then you, the driver, and there's definitely some loneliness and making certain that you get across okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back here to Phantom. He's got another tale to tell.
A CCA of the 9th was the one, as I told you about, got a presidential citation from holding the south shoulder, or establishing the south shoulder to the bulge. CCB of the 9th Armored was the one that captured Remagen Bridge, which was the first bridge across the Rhine. The Germans had partially blown it, but it didn't blow completely. It hadn't gotten down, and a Lieutenant Timmerman, I think, from the CCB had seen it and reported back, "What do I do?" And they said, "Go down and try to capture it." So he went down, and his men pulled the wires loose on the bottom of the bridge so that they couldn't finish blowing it. And then CCB went over, and they got a presidential unit citation for capturing Remagen.
Okay, the last story we have tonight is, Tiger, you had mentioned that a friend of yours was in a unit that was stationed in Kokel, Bavaria at the end of the war. And can you relate that story to us?
Well, I didn't even know about this till probably 40 years afterwards, because when we were stationed in Bavaria, we were in a little resort town on what they call Walchen Sea, which in this country they'd say Walchen Lake. But next to us was a town of Koschel or Kokel, or however you pronounce it. But didn't know till years later, but there's where a bunch of German scientists were, and that's where Werner von Braun was. So one of the guys in our outfit, I shouldn't say our outfit because he was B Company, I was C Company, and that's why I didn't know about it till many, many years later. But he, through guard duty, he finally found out, talking to this German scientist who was always talking about missiles and that, and evidently he wanted to talk to some Americans so that he could make some connection to get to the United States. And Werner von Braun, that's a familiar name too, did get to the United States, and I think they called it Operation Paperclip, and they smuggled them into the United States through Canada. But that's kind of interesting, but because that's a pretty famous name. But
No, gentlemen, what I'd like to do is we'll start over here with Phantom and come across, and if you can tell us when you return back to civilian life, what you did as a profession, and then who's with you here tonight.
As I said, I was in Nebraska, so I graduated from college one day and reported for service the next, and I had a one-year obligation as an ROTC grad. Pearl Harbor came along, and 1 year became 4.5. And so I was in for the duration. And after I got out, I went to school for another year and ended up every 2 weeks and circulated Minnesota and South Dakota. And my wife, Matilda, and my daughter, Lorna, are in the audience.
Well, first I worked at a bakery in the garage. I was a handyman there. Then I worked in a filling station. I worked in print shops. I did a lot of different jobs in my last 70 years. But I think the best one I had, well, I can't think of anything.
It's here tonight with us, I think. That's probably the best.
Yes, this is one of the best nights I had. I got my family with me, too.
Yeah, thank you. Bigger.
What do you want to know?
What did you do after the war? How you got to the United States?
Oh,
And who's with you?
how I came to the United States.
In 50 words or less.
That's
a start.
well, anyhow, it wasn't so easy for me. See, my parents lived as German citizens in Denmark. and I was in Germany. And if you ever have had to fill out papers, like discharge papers, there was no category for me. Which part of Germany are you from? Not if I didn't fill that out, I was in trouble. So anyhow, I had an uncle in Hanover who was that's the same, but he wasn't there anymore. But I said I was an agricultural student from Hanover, and they needed people to work in agriculture, so they sent me out immediately. And I got out, and then you got $5, and there you are. But anyhow, I came at one point, I decided I had to get back to Denmark. And I was in the middle of Germany. There wasn't even mail or anything yet. So I decided to go up to the Danish border in Flensburg. So I took the train up and landed in Flensburg. And I was there for quite a while. I thought I would sneak over the border, but I had an old green German uniform that I couldn't use in Denmark. They would have had me right away. So anyhow, I had to find some civilian clothes and everything. But then one day they said, oh, up at the Danish embassy, up on the hill, they take applications. So you just fill in an application. And I went up there and filled in an application, and it took them about 3 or 4 years to fill it out. But then after 3 or 4 years, I came back home and started to study and took my engineering degree, and then General Electric came along, and they hired me in Denmark and shipped me over to Louisville, Kentucky to start working for them.
That's good. And then eventually you moved on to 3M and came to lovely Minnesota.
Yeah, well, that's another long story.
I think we're getting called on time.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, I actually I worked for Harshaw Chemical in Cleveland. I worked for the lamp division there, and then Harshaw Chemical, and then at some point I hired in at the research lab here at 3M in St. Paul, and have been there about 50 years. Now I'm long retired, and actually if I had been able to, I would still work, but I am getting so old that they don't want me anymore.
Yeah. And you've got some family here. You've got a daughter, a granddaughter, and their spouses?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's Annette, my oldest daughter, and Teddy, her husband, and Tyra, my granddaughter, and Brett, her husband. So we have that. They are actually the Moores and the Jagers, but doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Thank you. Now we're going to go down to Tiger. Tiger, tell us, you came back to Minnesota, and did you go back to farming?
No, I didn't. I became a bricklayer, so I came to St. Paul to work, and so I lived down here ever since. So I tell you, I have a 50-year pin from the Bricklayers Union, and I meant to tell you my family here. I have a daughter and a son and a granddaughter and a grandson and his girlfriend and a nephew and his wife. So.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.